Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Jim Jatras. He was a U.S. diplomat in Mexico and a senior foreign policy advisor to the Republican leadership in the Senate. Also in D.C. is Democratic National Committeewoman Yasmine Taeb. She came to the United States as an undocumented immigrant and is now running to become a state senator in Virginia. And finally, in New York is Ravi Ragbir. He's a leading activist for immigration rights and currently faces deportation from the United States, even though he's called the country home for 3 decades. Good to have you all on the program. Yasmine Taeb, let me start with you. We look at the situation on the border. It is undoubtedly a political crisis. For many, it's a humanitarian crisis as well, especially from the perspective of the left. But is it also a crisis that needs to be solved at the root causes in the northern triangle of Central America, where the United States needs to maybe look at its own actions in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras?
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you so much for having me on today. You know, as you noted, what's happening right now at the southern border, but globally, we're in the midst of the worst refugee crisis ever. And when we're talking about what the U.S.'s responsibility is, and specifically in addressing our own actions and decades long of years of intervention that the U.S. has had in countries such as El Salvador, in Honduras, and Guatemala, countries that are now plagued by violence, families and children who are fleeing violence and poverty. The responsibility of the United States is simply to abide by our own domestic and international obligations. It's simply noted that it is a legal right for those that are at our borders to be able to file for asylum. And right now we have tens of thousands waiting, and this is the crisis that we need to be talking about and addressing.
Okay, so Jim Jatras, people would look at the Middle East and maybe they can make clear correlations and causations. They can say, well, U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 caused a whole lot of trouble, and that's why you can see a refugee crisis, from Syria and beyond. It's somewhat clear. Is it as clear to you, as somebody who worked within the system, when we talk about the Central American countries and people moving up for a better life to make it to the United States? Is it as clear as the Middle East?
I don't think so. I think there's certainly an element of that, and I certainly would be a critic of many aspects of American policy, not just in Latin America, but around the world. And let's remember, we have now people showing up at our border who are not necessarily from Latin America. We have Africans, for example, showing up and crossing illegally into the United States as well. I don't think we can reduce it to that, however. What you hold up with is essentially an attractive nuisance to say, look, if you cross the border illegally, you will be taken into the United States. You might be held temporarily, and then we're going to let you go and see whether or not you show up for your hearing to adjudicate your claim of asylum. And of course, a lot of these people, in fact, most of these people will not show up. We're basically saying the welcome mat is out. If you can get to the United States, you can stay. And I think that is really the main contributing factor here, that people say it's doable. I will improve my life measurably coming from a country that's poor, that's got violence of various sorts, and I think it's now uncontrollable.
Okay, I'm going to bring you in, Ravi, in a second. But in addition to Jim, I want you to hear from Senator Lindsey Graham in response to that horrible image we saw of a father and child washed up on the border. Have a little listen to Senator Graham.
Asylum claims should be made in the home country or in a facility in Mexico, because the reason he tried to go across the river, he was told by people in Central America, if you can put 1 foot on American soil, you're home free.
Go, Ravi.
So I have to disagree with Jim on many points he tried to make. One, there is direct correlation to what happens in this Northern Triangle and the reason why people are coming here. You look at the recent U.S.-backed coup in Honduras with elected President Zelaya, who was ousted. With the reason people are not leaving because of poverty. I mean, if you look at Nicaragua, before Ortega went crazy, Nicaragua is one of the lowest, has the highest poverty level. Yet people were not fleeing Nicaragua until the violence started. There's a lot of violence that is in the Northern Triangle, which was created by the U.S. You look at the drug policy, the drug war on drugs that they instituted in these areas, Guatemala, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. You look at the way they intercede in the politics of the country. And we talk about policies of foreign policies, but it's not just about foreign policies, but about U.S. interests in private interests, which the U.S. backs. So even we work with a lot of asylum seekers who have fled the Northern Triangle, who are saying that there's a land grab. The indigenous people who live on the coastline are being, their lands are being taken away from them, and they have to flee because they either face death or not. Okay. But let me make two quick points, right? Jim talked about people crossing illegally. That is not happening. People are actually trying to go to CBP and request asylum. And when they do come across, it is not that they don't show up for the hearings, but the fact is that ICE and USCIS are not given the right dates and times for the hearings. People are confused, including lawyers, including organizations who work on this for many years. They don't know what is happening because no one is getting correct information to literally make the system difficult for everyone to traverse.
Jim?
Look, I don't know where to begin with this. I would agree with many of the aspects of criticism, as I said, in our policy in Central America and other places in the world. I very rarely, by the way, agree with Lindsey Graham on anything. If the contention is that there are private interests located in the United States, and this goes back many decades, that help create instability in some of these countries, I'm entirely willing to agree with that. However, it does not then follow that we have an obligation to allow anybody who is displaced or has trouble in his own country to come into the United States and end up staying permanently in most cases, and because we have some kind of penance to live down for having been a contributing factor until these countries at some point in the future become a paradise where people prefer to stay home rather than come here. It's interesting to me that the same plutocratic interests that are at work in destabilizing some of these countries are themselves very strongly in favor of open borders, of bringing foreigners in. We think of the Koch brothers, for example, who are essentially open border libertarians. So I think the ones who get hurt in this is in the American economy, American taxpayers, American job seekers who are basically forced to pay the bill for bad policies, but the solution to that isn't say, y'all come in. The solution to that is you put up a wall and say you don't come in unless you come in through proper legal criteria.
Jim, I wonder what you think about this new bill, H.R. 2615, being tabled in Congress, the United States Northern Triangle Enhanced Engagement Act, to support the people of Central America and engage with these countries. Isn't that an admission within Congress, even though the Democrats have tabled this, Elliot Engel's the sponsor, Isn't this an admission that, okay, beyond whether conditions are bad, and conditions are bad, I mean, objectively, they're terrible on the border. Beyond that, we need to do something deeper and further back because this is unsustainable. Would you accept that something's fundamentally wrong?
I'm not sure it's an admission, and I would not be particularly optimistic that this bill will do anything good. Again, we seem to have two kinds of policies toward the world. For our friends, we have all sorts of aid programs that generally don't do all that much good, to tell the truth. And for our enemies, we have bombs and sanctions, and they don't do much good either. I would think that if we were smart, which we're not, we would be thinking in terms of what the Chinese are doing with their Belt and Road Initiative throughout Eurasia. We should be looking at ways to try to integrate and build the infrastructure throughout the Western Hemisphere and actually help in a partnership with these countries. I don't think this bill will do that.
Okay, some interesting ideas there. Yasmine Taeb, at the start of the year, when there was a government shutdown, the Democrats were saying this is a manufactured crisis from Trump. No, this is nonsense. There's nothing really happening on the border. Trump is manufacturing this. Do the Democrats need to do a bit of soul searching now and say that we got this wrong because there was a crisis? Because now you have the same Nancy Pelosi who's saying we're going to table bills and we're going to protect migrant children. 7 months ago, she was saying there's no crisis. Trump is just using it for political purposes.
It was a manufactured crisis because this administration was.
Go ahead, Yasmine.
This administration, sure. So this administration was calling little children refugees and asylum seekers and families that are trying to seek a safe haven in our country. He was referring to them as criminals, as members of gangs. He absolutely was a manufactured crisis. What we need to do right now as a party is we need to ensure that the U.S. lives up to what it's always been, and that's a welcoming country, a country that has always welcomed refugees. Our refugee resettlement program has traditionally been a bipartisan program. It's not a program that has been so politicized until this administration. This administration has not only gutted our refugee resettlement program, has effectively shut down the asylum process completely. When we're talking about, and Ravi had mentioned this, that the thousands of families and children and mothers and fathers who are at our borders right now, at ports of entry, trying to legally apply for asylum, the reason why they're absolutely crossing into the Rio Grande and losing their lives is out of desperation. It's not because they're simply trying to come here because they think it's easier here. They're doing it out of desperation to save their own lives. They've been waiting and waiting for months and months. The blame is solely on this administration because he's not even, again, abiding by our own domestic laws and international obligations.
Ravi Ragbir, I want to get your thoughts on something that might seem to be a small issue, but I want to fold it into this because I wonder if you think it's part of a broader systemic culture when it comes to this issue. News broke a few days ago. There was a ProPublica investigation about Facebook groups of Border Patrol agents saying very racist and terrible things about the people that they were processing and blocking and so on. Do you believe that there's something bigger and broader at play here when it comes to the U.S. and its perception of people trying to come in?
Well, when you look at the way they treat immigrants, migrants, children, families, everyone who has been living here for decades or people now coming in, and the only way you can justify the treatment of immigrants is to dehumanize them. So if we are made less than human, it makes it easier for them to do their job, to push, to exile people, to traumatize people, to terrorize people, because this immigration policy. So I want to say this policy didn't start with this administration. This immigration law is racist, and I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just going to talk about the 1996 law that was signed by a Democratic president, who was Clinton, that allowed or created the situation we're in right now. And then all the bringing together Department of Homeland Security. So when you see these posts are literally for them to be able to stop their conscience from acting, because if they treat people like these, in this way, and they're less than human, they are animals, they are not real, it makes it okay for them, because no matter what, every one of those officers have a speck of humanity in them. And we, as New Sanctuary and the work we do, believes that we can touch that humanity.
Right.
And if we can touch that humanity, it changes what is happening.
One final geopolitical question for you, Jim, and not going that far south, not looking at Honduras or El Salvador or Guatemala, but looking at the immediate neighbor, Mexico. Trump saying the Mexicans are not doing anything, not doing enough. The Mexicans are saying we're doing the best we can. Is it a fight worth picking right now where the president is not on good relations with the Mexicans because they're the final country that these migrants have to pass through before they reach the United States?
I'm not sure it's a particularly good strategy, but I think the options are somewhat limited. As was mentioned at the introduction of the program, I served as a consular officer in Mexico. This was some time ago. But I recall in those days, the Mexicans were absolutely ruthless. when it came to policing their border in a way that we never have been along our border. They were quite violent, quite repressive with people crossing illegally from Guatemala. And I don't think because they were racist. Ravi raised the racism card, which is the typical one that is used here. And I think that the Mexicans felt, and I think they do today, that La Patria, their fatherland, is an important thing and it needs to be protected. If we, however, as Americans feel that our country needs to be protected, and whether all of these people are desperate refugees, and I don't think they necessarily are in a lot of cases, how many are we obligated to take? 1 million, 2 million, 10 million, 100 million? There are a lot of very desperate people in the world. And at what point do our interests as a country, just like Mexico or Japan or any other country or Turkey, come to the fore and they say, it's all very sad about what goes on in the rest of the world, but we have our own country to think about. We cannot accept all of these people.
Okay, well, I think there are about 50 layers to this story, and we've peeled back about 5. So I'd love to have you all back on the program sometime soon, because the story is not going away anytime soon. But for the moment, I have to move on. Jim Jatras, Yasmine Taeb, and Ravi Ragbir, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers.